Professor Dick Howard, in what ways the contemporary world situation affects philosophy?
I think one can give two answers. The contemporary world situation can mean either the year 2000 or the world situation as it exists since 1989. So let me start with 1989, the overthrow of communism, the end of a kind of a hope that there was some new form, some third way between so-called communism and so-called capitalism. It seems to me that the idea of the third way is pretty much gone at this point. What does that then mean? It means, first of all, that we have to ask ourselves as philosophers, if there is no third way, and if the communist dream is absent, and if the capitalist reality is not the ideal that we would like to live with, then we have to ask ourselves, first of all, on what basis do we criticize capitalism? So the problem becomes the problem of critique. What's the basis of critique? What's the justification of critique? What does a critique look like? And then secondly, why would that critique be heard by a broader public? It's one thing for us philosophers to criticize, it's another thing for us philosophers to criticize in a way that the public can understand. From this perspective, the question of critique then poses the question, the philosophical question of judgment. And this was why already in an earlier book I argued that one had to make the move from Marx to Kant. And the Kant to whom I referred was not the metaphysician, and it was not the moralist of the second critique, rather it was the Kant of the third critique, the critique of judgment. And the issue was the issue then of what kind of judgments, what kind of critical judgments can we make? And so for me, my first point then would be that this world situation since 1989 poses the question of critique, and the question of critique leads to the question of judgment. Secondly, the end of communism seems to leave the issue of democracy as the only game on the table, yet you know from Peruvian experience, we know from American experience, Russian experience, that what's meant by democracy is very different in different contexts. And what I would want to argue, and this overlaps into the question of globalization, what I would want to argue is that the democracy that we have now worldwide is not an institutional democracy. Our task as philosophers is not the same as the task of political scientists, namely to invent institutions. Our task as philosophers, rather, is to understand democracy as an experience, or understand democracy as a way of life. And in this sense, the philosopher who's most relevant to us, the philosopher that we should be reading, you and I should be reading today, is Tocqueville, the author of Democracy in America. And I say that for at least the following reasons. First of all, for Tocqueville, democracy was not an institutional structure. Democracy was this way of life, this culture, if you will. And for example, when people talk about the domination of American imperialism or colonialism and so on, what they mean is not simply financial domination, but they mean cultural domination. And so the question is, what is this so-called democratic way of life? What are its penchants? What are its dangers? What are the ways in which it leans? And from this point of view, it would be the second volume of Tocqueville's Democracy in America that would be the most relevant. The one where Tocqueville asks, for example, what would a democratic poetry be like? Or how do democratic peoples think about philosophy? Or how do they think about war? And what we would want to do is we would analyze the structure of this democracy. And we would go back to the kind of, if you will, 19th century way of thinking about politics and political philosophy, where we have a given social situation. So, for example, democracy in Tocqueville's sense, let's not say what democracy means today yet, but in Tocqueville's sense, democracy means this growing presence of equality, this equalization of conditions, the overcoming of aristocratic barriers. Now, if equality is coming into existence more and more, what will this mean for the way that people think about one another? What will this mean for the way in which people relate to one another, and how will they understand themselves? Secondly, Tocqueville's problem, and our problem, is that if there is this coming democracy, And if we can see that it has virtues, yes, but it also has problems. Democracy is not an unmitigatedly good thing. Democracy, for example, if it means the rule of the people, can become a populism, and it can become just as despotic as other systems. For example, whether we talk about communism or whether we talk about fascism, both of them claim to be democratic. Both of them claim to overcome merely formal democracy. In Latin America, you of course have a populist tradition which claims to be democratic, but which, I needn't tell you, can have quite undemocratic consequences. So we need to then analyze not simply what is this democracy, what does it do to relations among people, but then we have to ask politically, how can we live with this democracy? How can we accommodate this democracy? Tocqueville, for example, was not a lover of democracy. Tocqueville, in many, was an aristocrat. Tocqueville would have probably preferred an aristocratic society, but he sees the inevitability of this new form, just like we see the inevitability of a certain globalized culture in the world that we live in. So the question is not, gee, let's forget about it. The question is not, can we hold it back? The question is, it's coming. Let's analyze it, and then let's see what we can do to ameliorate it, to make it somehow better. This leads me then to a third point, which is that I think one must distinguish between a democracy and a republic. And again, this is a Latin American tradition as well as a North American tradition and a European tradition. And the distinction I want to make would be the following. The Eastern European countries under Soviet domination called themselves democratic republics. And what they meant by that was that they were expressing, that their political systems were the expression of the sovereign popular will. And they were democratic in that sense that they represented the will of the whole, the will of the people. What I want to suggest is that a democracy, first of all, as a way of life, is based on division, and that the unity comes about through the Republican constitutional form. So what I want to suggest is that we can have a democratic republic, and that would be a populist, or it could be a fascist, or it could be even a communist form of government. In all events, it would be a form of government which would do away with the role and the place of individual rights, individual freedoms. It would refuse to recognize divisions within society. It would consider that anyone who has different opinions than me is wrong, is to be eliminated. As opposed to that, I want to say that the Republican democracy is one where the unity comes from the political forms, from the Republican forms, from the constitutional guarantees, and the democratic side is precisely the side that's built upon division, that's built upon the rights of the individual to differ with other individuals. So it seems to me that here one needs to think about these two forms. And one way that we can think of them is in terms of what I called once in an article 200 years of error, when I was trying to explain what 1989 meant. The 200 years of error were that in 1789, with the French Revolution, and in 1776 or 1787 with the American Revolution, the American Constitution, democracy became possible. That for the next 200 years, if we look at the history, the political theories of the period and so on, for the next 200 years there were attempts made constantly to suppress democracy, to overcome democracy. Liberalism with its idea of the market, the invisible hand of the market, does away with the divisions of a democratic society. Socialism, with its idea of the plan, does away with the divisions of a democratic society. Attempts at positivism, so in Latin America, the Comtean tradition in Latin American republicanism tries to do away with the forms of division. Populism, fascism, communism are all attempts to overcome that division. And it seems to me that in 1989, after 200 years of trying to eliminate division, of trying to do away with this, what I'm calling Republican democracy, we now have the possibility of realizing that which began 200 years previously with the birth of democracy. How's that for a first answer? Okay.
Is the globalization a new name of neocolonialism?
Here, this is one place where I think that the old Marx was interesting. You remember that when you read Marx, there's not only his famous writings, Capital and the Critique of Alienation and so on, but all of his political writings are, I think, interesting in this regard. For example, his writings about India, where or let's go back even further, in the Communist Manifesto. Communist Manifesto, when you read the first part of it, is a hymn of praise to capitalism, to globalism. Marx thinks that capitalism is wonderful. It's the most revolutionary thing in the world because it's breaking down these old barriers. Then later in the writings about India and the writings about Latin America and so on, Marx is constantly defending capitalism because it's overcoming these older traditions. So in that sense, my first inclination is to say that globalization is good because it's overcoming barriers. It's making for new possibilities. And that for us to simply say, let's stop it, is first of all, probably not possible. Secondly, probably not desirable. And once again, it seems that the issue is now, how can we go about living with it? So here, first point then, reread Marx. One has to be realistic. One doesn't want to criticize globalism in the name of the good old days, because the good old days weren't so good. There is a progress that takes place. Secondly, I think that one has to ask oneself, in terms of what? Why do we want to criticize globalism? Here, I think that if I look at the, let's call it the left-wing anti-globalist position, so Seattle and the kind of demonstrations against the World Trade Organization and so on, it seems to me that these demonstrations are based upon anti-Americanism. They're based on an attitude which is anti-bourgeois. The bourgeoisie is bad. And thirdly, they use the term fascism without knowing quite what it means. And they talk about democracy, but what would it mean to democratize the world trade system? Here, I think that we philosophically have to make a further step. I think we have to say this. I just wrote an article in German, sort of short article, making the following case. It seems that we have to say, first of all, that in the 1980s, go back, 1976, 77, 78, the U.S. economically begins to have problems. You have the oil crises, you have the beginnings of a decline of the U.S., and everybody in the U.S. is talking about the Japanese model as the model of the future. Then Reagan comes to power, and then you have the move towards globalization on the American side. How can we explain that move? It seems to me that what happens is that in the early 1980s in America, what we have to call the class struggle took place, and the capitalists won. And I think it is the case that in the United States, the capitalists have won. And what does it mean that the capitalists have won? It's not so much these super profits that they've made. Rather, it's that they've been able to give a form to the global trading system that works to their advantage. If you look at what the World Trade Organization is actually doing, what they're doing is creating markets for so-called intellectual goods, copyrights on records, on computer programs, and so on. They're creating property, right? When the genome becomes something that you can patent, when an algorithm that you make a computer program with becomes something that you can patent, you're creating property. Here's another philosophical issue. In what sense is a computer program property? In the good old days when we read John Locke or even Karl Marx, property was that in which I invested my labor. Now property is that which is created as property. So the capitalists win, they create this global trading system. Secondly, they win in another sense. They do away with tariff barriers, they do away with limits on migration of labor and on migration of capital. What that means is that the U.S. becomes the agent of this capitalist invasion, on the one hand, but on the other hand, we can use the slogan, and this will, I think, provoke you. We can use this, we can say that the United States, in relation to Europe, is like Latin America in relation to the United States. That is to say that the United States is the third world of Europe. You have a kind of a European capitalism, civilized, so-called Rhinish, Rhineland capitalism, kind of a civilized, or attempt at least to create a civilized capitalism. You have a savage, wild capitalism with no limits in America. Now, what is it, in what sense is America the third world to Europe? Well, the same way that Latin America to the US. When our workers in America threaten to go out on strike or demand higher wages, what do the capitalists say? They say, well, if you insist on higher wages, we'll just move our plants to Latin America, where there's cheaper labor, right? Or we will hire Latin American illegal workers. If you American workers don't accept flexibilization, if you don't accept shorter, not shorter hours, but more flexible hours, if you don't accept certain innovations in the labor process, we'll move. The same thing is now going on with Europe and the United States. Where does Mercedes have its newest factories? In Alabama. The U.S. With its lack of labor laws, with its lack of any controls on the functioning of capital, becomes a threat to Europe. In that sense, what needs to take place is at a global level, and here globalization now can be used positively. There has to be a global alliance between labor and a certain kind of European, if you will, civilized capital. And so this is where then, once again, I would say that globalization is positive, and it's going to be positive even in the third world, but only if there is a politically organized structure. And this then points to the next political problem, which is, of course, what's the relationship between globalization and the nation state? And can we, at some global level, do what the old nation state did? Or should we defend the old nation state system? And my intuition, my suggestion here is that one needs to move to the higher level. That if I take the US-American example, in US history, in the 19th century, many of the progresses of social benefits of labor, if you will, much of the anti-capitalist movements, populist movements, took place at the level of the states, so in Illinois, in Wisconsin, and so on. And what happened was that the capitalist counteroffensive took control at the national level. Now, at the national level, there is progress in some places. There's an attempt to roll it back. One has to move to the higher level and form a new type of alliance. What that would look like is not something that I'm going to say today. Okay?
Professor Howard, is Marxism totally dead?
Is Marxism totally dead? Marx's thought is not totally dead. That is to say, what do we mean by Marx's thought? We don't mean a fixed set of theorems, of theses. Rather, what we mean, or what I would mean, is this critical method that I talked about earlier. This idea of how does one go about thinking in such a way that one is critical of the existing order, but at the same time that one's criticism can be heard, can be understood in a broader sphere. Or let me put it differently. In a footnote to his doctoral dissertation, so when he was very young, Marx has a phrase which I think is the phrase that defines all the rest of his work. He says, what we have to do is we have to make philosophy worldly and the world philosophical. That is, we have to find a way, we have to show somehow why and how it is that philosophy, in order to realize itself, that philosophy, in order to be true, if you will, must have an effect in the world. Otherwise, it's mere moralism. It's mere intellectualism. So philosophy must become worldly, but the world also must become philosophical, that is to say, rational, that is to say, human, however we define our notion of philosophy. And if we take that as Marx's slogan, then if you look all through Marx's work, whether it's the discussion of alienated labor, whether it's the criticism of the abstract political state, whether it's his writings about the 1848 revolutions, whether it's Das Kapital, Marx is constantly worried about this phenomenon of the philosophy becoming worldly, the world becoming philosophical. Secondly, when we talk about Marxism, the problem, of course, is like the problem that Christians have. There are too many supposed theses of orthodoxy. But let me just take one of them for a minute that I only recently noticed. You remember in Marx's essay on the Paris Commune, where he talks about the Paris Commune as this form, this democratic form, this popular form where all the people participate, where we overcome the abstract democratic state. The formalism of the abstract state is overcome by the Paris Commune. But if you read the text, he actually says that the Paris Commune is the form which has been finally found, in which the class struggle can be fought out. That is to say, that there is a role for political institutions. So I think that, for example, by taking a notion like that from Marx, we can go back to what I said about globalization, finding a form in which the class struggle, in which the attempt to realize philosophy can be worked out. So my answer would be that reading Marx becomes crucial. In fact, let me even put it more strongly. Marxism is dangerous if it's not, first of all, in the hands of philosophers, because then it becomes a set of theories or theses. It becomes simplified. In a certain sense, I would even say that if I were today going to teach a young person how to think philosophically, I can think of no better work to read than Marx, but I would read all of Marx. Not every letter, obviously, but in all of the sort of important works, to see the problems, to see how he constantly questions himself in a way that very few, certainly contemporary philosophers, in fact, do. So Marx is relevant as a way of asking questions, as a form of critique, not as a set of theses about the world. Okay?
Professor Howard, is democracy the better way of government?
Let me make the argument that democracy is not a way of government. That democracy is a form of life. And here, I think what we need to introduce into our discussion that we haven't mentioned yet, and I didn't mention it because I don't know enough about Latin American debates, but for me in the US and for me in France and Europe generally, the crucial phenomenon to reflect upon is the phenomenon of totalitarianism. And totalitarianism comes into being, first of all, totalitarianism is not the same as despotism. It's not the same as dictatorship. Despotism, dictatorship, we knew from the history of political philosophy going back to the Greeks, going back to the very beginning. But the notion of totalitarianism doesn't arise until democracy emerges. Democracy as a social form, as a form of life. And why does totalitarianism emerge at that point? It emerges because, on the one hand, democracy brings with it the idea of the self-rule of the people. So the old Greek notion, rule of the people, power of the people. On the other hand, democracy brings with it the idea of individual rights. And that idea of individual rights brings with it the idea of division. Because if I have a right I have a right to be different than you. Once that problem of democracy then emerges historically, then the quest for overcoming division emerges. In prior pre-democratic societies, say in feudalism, the idea of totalitarianism makes no sense, because if you were a noble and I was a commoner, there was nothing that we shared. In Plato's days, in the Greeks, there's no notion of a unity where we would all be one. Right? And with democracy that emerges. And then secondly, with democracy emerges the idea of a distinction between, if you will, the formal institutional structures and the social reality. So in the 19th century in France, for example, you see people talking about the difference between the pays réel, the real country, and the pays officiel, the formal country. And you see anti-parliamentarianism emerging, you see populist forms emerging, and so on. Take populism, these populist forms don't necessarily become totalitarian, but there's a constant danger. And if we look at the two clearly totalitarian forms, namely, let's call them Stalinist communism and Hitlerist fascism, where you have a clear notion of totalitarianism, in both cases, they come to power as a quest for true democracy. So to answer if you ask Hitler or Stalin the question, is democracy the best form of rule? They would say, of course it is. And that's what we're doing, right? They would say, we're ruling in a truly democratic way. And that, of course, is ridiculous. But now, it seems to me that one has to understand, therefore, that democracy is constantly threatened by its own self-destruction. Democracy is not only a good form, and this is why I mentioned Tocqueville earlier. Democracy is not only good. Democracy has negative sides. And so when we confront the world, you asked earlier, the world of the year 2000, what does it pose for philosophy as problems? We could say that it poses the problem of distinguishing between the good and the bad, the positive and the negative sides of this new global democracy. And so we have to ask ourselves, Milosevic in Serbia, or Putin in Chechnya, or Fujimori in Peru. You may want to edit this. Whichever, any populist form. Alan Garcia was also a populist, after all. They're claiming a democratic legitimation, but what is it that's democratic about their legitimacy? And so again, I would want to insist on that distinction that I made earlier between a democratic republic, where one claims that the people are ruling, and the people must be one, united, there must be no division, and so on, and a republican democracy, that is to say, a system where there are individual rights guaranteed, where there is partisan division among political parties and so on that exists, and yet at the same time there's a unity provided by that republican structure. So, and one last point here, since we're talking about philosophy and professional philosophy, this distinction between a republican democracy and a democratic republic, and the idea is democracy the best form of rule. You remember that Kant asked that question in the essay on perpetual peace. And he, too, opposes democracy. He says explicitly, democracy is not a form of government, says Kant. Right? It's not a form of rule. Democracy is a way in which the people, the society, if you will, lives. So no, democracy is not the best form of rule. But there's one phrase in Tocqueville that I want to come back to and think about, which is, he says, I don't like democracy for what it is, I like it for what it makes people do. That is to say, the virtue of this democracy, he says, remember he was writing about America in the 1830s, this unruly, this ungovernable, this crazy country in some ways. He doesn't like the democracy for what it is, but it's a way of life that makes people act, that gives them the sense that they can take initiatives, that they can do things on their own. So what we philosophers want, after all, is not to tell people how to live. What we want is, how can we create a system in which people have the possibility of deciding how they, each of them individually, want to live, as long as, of course, their way of life is compatible with the ways of life of other people. And we want to have certain notions of constitutional limitation and so on. But basically, I think that the danger for us philosophers then would be to think of democracy as a form of rule, which I don't think it is. It's not a form of government. Okay.
Is the capitalism the end of history?
Capitalism, let me put it this way, using, again, that distinction between a form of society and a political form. Capitalism, as I said about globalization, capitalism is a political form. Capitalism creates certain types of political relations. What we have to think about is not capitalism as the exploitation of workers, but capitalism as a way of coping with, a way of dealing with the new problems that are posed by the democratic societies that emerge with the French and the American revolutions, that spread to Latin America with the liberation in the 1830s and so on. Capitalism is a political choice. It's not an economic choice. Or if you insist on capitalism as an economic system, then I would say with Max Weber, another crucial figure for anybody to think who's thinking about contemporary society, then I would say with Max Weber that capitalism has always existed and will always exist, insofar as people will always have to earn a living, will always have to feed themselves. And in some way or another, they will work in a competitive manner with their fellow citizens to make the best of their economic life. But that the economy, think of it this way, for any classical philosopher, the economy is subordinate to the political sphere. Today, we have politicians saying to us that our political decisions are determined by global economic necessities. If that's true, then we're in a terrible situation. If that's true, then everything that we political philosophers have tried to do since the Greeks is meaningless. In other words, what the politicians are saying to us is that our actions are governed by necessities. And if our actions are governed by necessities, whether they're economic necessities or whether they're any other kind of necessities, certainly if our actions are governed by economic necessities, then we have no freedom. And if we have no freedom, then there's no place for politics, for political philosophy whatsoever. So I would want to insist then on this idea that, again, capitalism is a political choice. And in this sense, I don't know if you saw this, do you remember about 6 months ago, there was a letter to the Socialist International written by Tony Blair and Gerhard Schroeder, in which they talked about the necessities of globalization and so on, and the necessities of a market society was their term. And Lionel Jospin, the French Prime Minister, also a socialist, had the following phrase. He said, "We are in favor of a society with a market. We are not in favor of a market society." Now, a society that's completely determined by the market. Yes, there will be markets. Yes, there will be something like, I would, to answer your question, I think I would prefer to say, there will always be markets. They need not have a capitalist political form. They could, for example, we can think of markets that are based on barter. We can think of markets that are based upon kinds of exchange which include gifts of various kinds. We can think of markets where you have, for example, small-scale lending to women who are going to set up their own entrepreneurial ventures. We can think of all sorts of ways of having markets within the society without having the market dominate the society. Okay?